This morning we continue our series, Big Fish, Bigger Gods, going through the book of Jonah. Can I encourage you to open up your Bibles or turn them on and follow the narrative of Jonah chapter 1 verse 4 to 16. Finding it in a paper Bible may be a little bit tricky. It can be found in the Old Testament, stuck between Obadiah and Micah, and Jonah is known as one of the 12 minor prophets, not because the message it contains is minor or insignificant in any way, but it's just simply a smaller sized book. In fact, this small book contains some big things, with the Hebrew word gadol, meaning great or big, being used 14 times in the 48 verses. Last week we heard that Jonah had a big fear of what God was asking him to do and he ran away. This week we pick up the next part of the story with the title Big Storm, Bigger Gods. And Nikki is going to read the passage for us now.
Jonah chapter 1 verses 4 to 16. Then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. All the sailors were afraid, and each cried out to his own God, and they threw the cargo into the sea to lighten the ship. But Jonah had gone below deck, where he lay down and fell into a deep sleep. The captain went to him and said, "How can you sleep? Get up and call on your God. Maybe he will take notice of us, so that we will not perish." Then the sailors said to each other, "Come, let us cast lots to find out who is responsible for this calamity." They cast lots, and the lot fell on Jonah. So they asked him, "Tell us, who is responsible for making all this trouble for us? What kind of work do you do? Where do you come from? What's your country, and from what people are you?" He answered, "I'm a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the dry land." This terrified them, and they asked, "What have you done?" They knew he was running away from the Lord, because he had already told them so. The sea was getting rougher and rougher, so they asked him, "What should we do to you to make the sea calm down for us?" "Pick me up and throw me into the sea," he replied, "and it will become calm. I know that it is my fault that this great storm has come upon you." Instead, the men did their best to row back to land, but they could not, for the sea grew even wilder than before. Then they cried out to the Lord, "Please, Lord, do not let us die for taking this man's life. Do not hold us accountable for killing an innocent man, for you, Lord, have done as you pleased." Then they took Jonah and threw him overboard, and the raging sea grew calm. At this the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him.
For Jonah and the sailors in this storm, and also for us in other storms or hard times that we may go through in our lives, what we believe about God will often be revealed and at times reframed during those hard times. We've seen this in the last few months around the world. As the World Health Organization declared a pandemic in March this year, the worldwide searches online for prayer surged, including in the most secular of Western nations. Despite increased secularism and a decline in church attendance and organised religion in these nations, in this pandemic, in this storm, people like the sailors in Jonah chapter 1, they're crying out to God. They're searching after God. This storm is revealing in them and in us a deep held belief and desire that there is a God and he can be communicated with. We've seen that also in the hashtag pray for movements that flow out of various terrorist attacks that have taken place over the last few years. Storms of life rock the boat, and in rocking the boat, people's views and beliefs about God can be revealed and reframed. So many people at this time have become more open, and they're searching, seeking, questioning the big things of life and searching after God. Maybe you're listening or watching this morning and you are searching after God. Whether you are a seeker or a seasoned follower, I want to give you a few moments to think about this question for yourself. For you, what beliefs or ideas about God and faith have been revealed or reframed during this coronavirus storm? In Jonah chapter 1, we read of a great wind, violent storm. That's in verse 4. Verse 11, an increasingly rough sea. And in verse 13, the sea grew even wilder than before. And all this was not just mere bad luck for the sailors, but the passage makes it really clear that the storm that they experience is sent by God. Verse 4 says, then the Lord sent a great wind on the sea, and such a violent storm arose that the ship threatened to break up. This is quite a hard thing for many of us to comprehend. Why would a God of love send a storm? I want to try and answer that question this morning, but also then think about how the sailors and Jonah's beliefs are revealed and reframed, beliefs about themselves and about God, revealed and reframed during this narrative. Whilst the bigger question, does God cause all storms in life, is also a very important one. It's not the focus of this specific passage or message today. Maybe we can come back to that at a specific session at some point in the future. This morning we're focusing in on this storm in Jonah chapter 1 being caused by God. And I guess for Jonah and the sailors, and for other people as they read it, they may read it as and understand the chaos of the storm to be a display of the anger that God has against Jonah, smiting him or punishing him in order to get him to submit to what God wanted him to do. You can see where that impression comes from as you look at the greatness of the storm and their attempts to appease the anger of God. Whilst I can see the logic behind this answer and understand why they thought this, I don't believe that that's why God sent this storm. I think the correct reading of it is that God is trying to display his total control, that he is omnipotent, all-powerful, that God himself is bigger than the storm. He's in control of the storm itself. He starts it in verse 4, stops it in verse 15, and in between he also arranges for the lots that are cast to point towards Jonah. God is in control. He is mighty, powerful, sovereign, and will bring about his purposes through whatever means or methods that he chooses, whether that's a comfortable thing for us or comfortable thought for us or not. God reveals his control and power to Jonah. Two lessons that he needed to learn, and probably why God sent the storm. But as I read this passage and prayed during the week, I believe God wants to also show a further and deeper, more beautiful reframing of the storm that's still in line with God displaying his power and control, but also points to the beauty and enormity of God's heart. As we reframe the storm, something fresh is revealed about God. God did send the storm to show his might and power and control. But it was not just a display to make Jonah feel afraid. This isn't a storm of anger, but a storm that shows the power of God, and at a deeper level reveals the furious longing of a holy and mighty God of love for the people he has created. God's furious longing for them to realize the error of their ways, and his furious longing to forgive them and to bring about a clean slate. This isn't a mere display of discipline or anger or strength, sovereignty and control. It's a display of the passionate heart of an almighty and deeply loving God that wants people to know the truth, both about the putridity of our sin and about the enormity of his love. This is a display, in this storm, it's a display of the passion of God and the power and authority of God to enact upon his passion. God revealing his mighty power and his passion to save. This storm reveals God's furious longing to reach and get through to the sailors, to get through to Jonah, to get through to the people of Nineveh, to get through to us. And if God hadn't sent this storm, well, each of these people, the sailors, Jonah, and the people of Nineveh would all be lost. I want us to have a closer look at the sailors and Jonah and what this storm both reveals about them and their beliefs, but also how a reframing takes place regarding what they believe about themselves and about God. Let's look at the sailors first. The sailors show us that our faith can have the wrong focus, but the right actions. These mariners were shaken by the furious nature of the storm that they faced. In the middle of the storm, in their fear and desperation, they cry out to their own probably multiple gods, small g, verse 5, each having their own deities. These sailors were Gentiles. They didn't know or worship or follow our God, the God of heaven, the Lord who made the sea and the dry land, God, big G. Their actions also suggested that they believed that they could save themselves in some way, shape or form from the storm that God had sent. The mariners frantically try and save themselves by throwing cargo overboard, believing that they can do something that will appease the anger of the God of the sea, revealing what they believed about God. Or as Jonah had revealed to them, that it wasn't just God of the sea, but God who made the sea. They were trying to appease him. Although these actions of trying to save themselves aren't right, it shows that they are seekers. Seekers both after God and after deliverance. Verse 5 and verse 6 and verse 14 show that. They're seekers of forgiveness from God. Verse 14, as they throw Jonah into the sea at his instruction, they seek God's forgiveness. And they seek to follow. Verse 16, at this the men greatly feared the Lord, and they offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows to him. What vows did they make? Were they saying, God, we'll follow you for the rest of our lives? What promises did they make to God as he had revealed to them something of his character, his heart and his power? These actions that the sailors make are good actions, actions that would have been helpful for Jonah to take on board. Through the storm, God reveals himself to them and they turn and worship him. The focus of their faith and their fear is made right. Let's have a look now at Jonah. And Jonah shows us that we can have the right focus of faith, but the wrong actions. That is, that we can have sincere held belief in God, like Jonah, but not allow it to impact the decisions we make and the actions we take. Jonah runs away from God in verse 3, fleeing from the presence of God. And he knows of God's power. In chapter 4, verse 2, we see that he knows of God's heart to be merciful and compassionate. Yet this knowledge has not led him to obedience. He worships the Lord, or as in verse 9, where it says that I worship the Lord, the more frequent translation of the words is fear. I fear the Lord. Yet he's not obedient to the Lord. Verse 10, he's shared with the sailors that he's running away from God. The focus of his faith is right, but his actions are wrong. Is this because his view of God was too small? Or was it maybe that his view of himself was too big? Maybe that's a question that we need to ask ourselves as well. During this storm, is our view of God too small? Do we need to actually think less of ourselves, or actually have the right view of ourselves reformed within us as we see the enormity of the power of God and the enormity of his love? And in examining Jonah in the storm, it's also helpful to ask the question, why didn't God simply choose someone else? I believe God wanted to do something through Jonah and also in Jonah, to reframe his view of God and of people and of himself, to challenge his judgmentalism, to challenge his view of God's wonderful grace, to challenge his view of God's ability to bring about change in people's lives. He struggled to accept the loving mercy and grace of God for himself and for others as well. He knew God would forgive the Ninevites, but he didn't want them to receive God's mercy. He needed a fresh revelation and a fresh understanding of God, not just head knowledge, but impacting his heart and the way he viewed himself and everything else in life. Jonah needed to learn that God was not just someone to fear, verse 9. Even though he had many reasons to fear God, the greatness of the storm would have been one of them. But as a Hebrew, which he says he is, he would have also known the description of God As the description of God from Exodus 34, that the Lord Almighty is first of all gracious and compassionate, slow to anger and abounding in love. That God is love. He is what love is. His name, his character, his actions. He's love, gracious and compassionate. Yes, God deals with sin and should be rightly revered because he's holy, he's pure, he's perfect, he's powerful. But this fear of God needs also to be held in the balance of his love, his mercy and his grace. I wonder if God needs to reframe that in some of our minds this morning. God is holy and loving, pure and compassionate, powerful and gracious, mighty and tender. Jonah needed to have his understanding of God reframed. He needed to wake up from his sleep, verse 5, and see what God was revealing about himself through this storm. God's not just to know things about God up here in his head, but to allow the knowledge of God to be in here in his heart. Did he allow the storm that God sent to do that? Will we? The story of Jonah is an abbreviated story of the whole message of the Bible. And in this storm, we see that the meta-narrative of the Bible, the big story of the Bible, is in micro form. Because of sin, humanity runs away from God. Yet God chases after each fear-filled, rebellious created being in order to show the extravagance of his love, grace and forgiveness, and also to fulfill his purposes within that being's life. God has a furious longing for people to know about the truth, to know the truth about sin and the truth about him, to know love and to be loved by him for eternity. He has the power also to get this message through to the people. Jonah's story is our story. It's a story of God reaching out. It's a story of God restoring. It's a story of God releasing in order to fulfill his purposes. And I love how God uses the failings of a fear-filled runner. God uses the failings of Jonah to bring a group of sailors who were far from God to a place of encounter and worship of the Lord. It's a sign of God's wonderful grace and God being the ultimate evangelist, the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry lands. That is God, the Lord, gracious and compassionate. There was another man who went to sleep in a boat during a storm. He too was woken. He too sacrificed himself to save others. We read of this storm in Mark chapter 4, verse 35 to 41. It's talking about Jesus. Jesus is in the boat and he calms the storm instantly by saying, "Be still, be quiet." And his followers question who he is. They don't know, they haven't grasped yet, they don't understand his enormous power as he's with them in the boat. Jesus is God revealed, almighty, all-powerful. Even the wind and the waves obey him, but he's also all-loving. God, sovereign, mighty, great, Gadol. He's the Lord, the God of heaven who made the sea and the dry land, verse 9. And he has a furious longing for people who are far from him, whether you're part of his people or not yet to come to him and know the truth about sin and the truth about him and his love. In the same way that the sailors were saved through the sacrifice of Jonah, we can be rescued and restored through the sacrifice of Jesus. This is a call both to the seeker and the seasoned follower. To have our understanding of God reframed during this storm. God has shown his heart. God has shown his power and he's giving his invite. The question is, during this storm, how will you and I respond?